My brother locked my 1-year-old son outside in below freezing weather and called it a lesson. It was New Year's Eve. I was still in my work clothes, standing in a hospital hallway, holding my phone so tight my fingers had gone numb. The call came in at 9:10 p.m. It wasn't from my family, it was from my neighbor. With a shaking voice, she said to me, "Emily, I think Ethan's been standing outside on the porch for a while now. He looks really cold." I didn't believe it. I couldn't. So I called her back and asked her to video call me. And when that screen lit up, I saw my son. 11 years old, standing in the dark, arms wrapped around himself, his whole body trembling in the cold. Right then, a wave of fear and guilt hit me so hard I could barely breathe. I pressed my back against the hallway wall just to keep myself upright. At that moment, I didn't know this wasn't just about one night. It was about something that had started weeks earlier. Hi everyone, my name is Emily. I'm 42 years old, and this story happened 2 weeks before New Year's Eve. I'm a family lawyer based in Chicago. I've spent over 15 years helping other people fight for their kids, protect their rights, and draw hard lines when they needed to. I thought that made me tough. I thought I knew how messy families could get. I had no idea how wrong I was, until it happened to my own. My husband passed away when Ethan was just 6 years old. 5 years of raising him alone, working full-time, trying to be both mom and dad at the same time. It was exhausting. But Ethan was my whole world, and I would have done it forever if I had to. Then I met Daniel. He was 38, an architect, quiet and steady, in a way that felt like solid ground after years of standing in quicksand. I fell for him slowly, carefully, and when we got married, I genuinely believed we were building something real. But Ethan didn't see it that way. From day one, he kept his distance. He was polite enough on the surface, but cold underneath. He never called Daniel by name if he could avoid it. Never sat next to him at dinner. Never let him drive him to school. I kept telling myself it was just going to take time. I kept trying to find the balance between being a good mom and being a good wife, and I kept failing at both. And then there was the other side of my life pulling at me too. My parents and my brother Mark had started putting pressure on me. Not about Daniel, not yet. It was about money. Mark had run his business into the ground and was drowning in debt, and my parents decided that was somehow my problem to fix. Every call, every visit, every family dinner was starting to feel like a negotiation I hadn't agreed to. At that time, I thought the tension in my house was the biggest problem I was dealing with. I was wrong. It was a Tuesday night, about 10 days before New Year's Eve. I remember because I had just closed a brutal custody case that afternoon and came home completely drained. The house was quiet when I walked in, which should have been a good sign. It wasn't. Daniel was in the kitchen, trying to put together a simple dinner. Ethan was at the table, doing homework, not looking up. I set my bag down and tried to read the room. The air felt tight, like something had already happened, but nobody wanted to be the one to say it first. I went upstairs to change, and by the time I came back down, the silence had shifted into something worse. I heard Ethan's voice, low and clipped, cutting through the kitchen. He said without looking up from his notebook, "You don't have to pretend you care about what I'm eating." Daniel, still calm, still patient, replied as he set a plate on the counter. "I'm not pretending. I made extra because I thought you might be hungry after practice." For a second, I thought it would stop there. It didn't. Ethan pushed back from the table, and with a voice that was shaking but certain, he said directly to Daniel, "You're not my dad. You don't get to do things for me." The words hit the room like a stone through glass. Right then, my throat closed up, and I stood frozen in the doorway, not knowing whether to step in or stay back. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He set down the spoon he was holding, turned slowly, and looked at Ethan with an expression I still can't fully describe. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to exhaustion mixed with heartbreak. Before I could say anything, Ethan's voice cracked as he said louder this time, "I want you to leave. This isn't your house. You shouldn't even be here." The silence that followed felt like it had weight. I finally moved. I stepped into the kitchen and said as steadily as I could manage, "Ethan, that's enough. You can't talk to him like that." But Ethan turned to me, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Not just anger, desperation. He said with his voice breaking, "Why does he get to stay? Dad is gone, and you just replaced him like he didn't matter." And just like that, every word I had prepared, every calm and rational response I thought I had ready, disappeared. Because he wasn't entirely wrong, and we both knew it. I stood there, caught between the boy I was raising and the man I had chosen, and I couldn't find a single thing to say that would have helped either of them. Daniel picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He didn't slam it. He didn't make a scene. He just looked at me quietly and said in a voice so low only I could hear, "I'll give him some space tonight." And then he walked out the front door. Ethan went straight to his room without another word. I stayed in the kitchen alone, staring at the plate of food Daniel had made, still warm on the counter. A slow and hollow ache spread through my chest, the kind that doesn't come from one thing going wrong, but from realizing you've been losing ground for a long time without noticing. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying every moment, every choice I had made over the past 2 years, wondering where exactly I had missed something important. The next morning, Daniel didn't come back, and I realized something was breaking inside my family. 2 days after that night, Daniel texted me and asked if we could talk. Not at the house. Somewhere neutral. I suggested a coffee shop about a mile from my office, a small place with wooden tables and bad lighting that I'd been going to for years whenever I needed to think. He was already there when I arrived, sitting with his hands wrapped around a mug, looking like a man who hadn't slept much either. I sat down across from him and didn't know how to start. He did it for me. He leaned forward slightly and said with a steadiness that caught me off guard, "I'm not going anywhere. I just want you to know that." I looked at him and felt something loosen in my chest, but I didn't let myself lean into it yet. I said carefully, "Daniel, what happened the other night was not okay, and I don't know how to fix it." He nodded slowly and replied without a hint of resentment in his voice, "I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm not asking Ethan to like me either. I just don't want to be the reason your family falls apart." Right then, something inside me twisted. Because that was exactly what I was afraid of, and hearing him say it out loud made it more real than I was ready for. I looked down at my coffee and asked quietly, "How are you not angry right now?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said in a calm and measured way, "I am angry, but I'm also a grown man. And he's an 11-year-old kid who lost his dad. Those aren't the same thing." I didn't have a response to that. I just sat there and let it settle. The thing about Daniel that had drawn me to him from the beginning was exactly this. He didn't perform patience. He actually had it. And sitting across from him in that small coffee shop, watching him choose grace over ego when he had every right to do the opposite, I felt something shift in me. Not relief. Not yet. But something like clarity. Still, the doubt crept in right after. Because I kept turning the question over in my head, was I putting Ethan through something he wasn't ready for just because I didn't want to be alone? Was I being selfish dressed up as someone trying to move forward? Every time I thought I had the answer, the ground shifted under me again. Daniel reached across the table and said gently as he looked me in the eye, "I'm not going to push him, but I'm also not going to disappear just because it's hard. That's not what you do when you love someone." I swallowed hard and looked away for a second. Because the truth was, part of me was still waiting for him to give up. Part of me had been bracing for the moment he would decide we were too complicated, too broken, too much work, and he just kept not doing that. We sat there for another hour, talking through the small, practical things. Where he'd stay for the next few days, how we'd handle the holidays, whether we should look into family counseling. It felt almost ordinary, the way we were planning around the wreckage, and maybe that was the point. Maybe that was what real looked like, but none of that mattered, because something else was already set in motion. To understand what happened on New Year's Eve, you have to go back 2 months earlier, because that's when the real trouble started. Not with Ethan, not with Daniel, with my own family. It was a Sunday afternoon in late October. My parents had invited me over for lunch, just the three of us, they said, nothing big. But when I pulled into the driveway, I saw Mark's car already parked out front. My stomach dropped a little. Mark and I had never been close, not as kids and definitely not as adults. He was 3 years younger than me, and for most of our lives he had operated on the assumption that things would work out for him eventually, without him having to do much to make that happen. He'd tried 3 different businesses in the past 8 years. A food truck, a gym franchise, and most recently, some kind of online retail operation that I never fully understood. None of them lasted. And each time one collapsed, the family would quietly absorb the damage and move on without ever saying the word failure out loud. I walked in, and my mom was setting the table with that specific kind of brightness she puts on when she's nervous. My dad was sitting in his chair by the window, not saying much. Mark was on the couch, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, which was never a good sign. We got through about 15 minutes of small talk before Mark leaned back and said with a casualness that was clearly rehearsed, "So listen, I need to talk to you about something." I set down my glass and replied flatly, "Okay." He glanced at my parents once, then looked back at me and said in a tone that was trying very hard to sound reasonable, "I'm in a rough spot right now. The business didn't work out the way I planned, and I've got some debt I need to deal with. I was hoping you could help me out with $20,000. The number landed in the room like something heavy dropped on a hardwood floor. I didn't flinch on the outside, but inside my mind was already running through every single time I had been down this road before. Because this was not the first request, not even close. Over the years, I had lent Mark money 3 separate times. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. He had never paid back a single dollar. Not once. Not with interest, not without, not with a timeline, not with so much as an acknowledgement that the money had ever existed. I looked at him steadily and said without raising my voice, "Mark, I'm not going to do that." The temperature in the room changed immediately. My mom stopped moving around the table and said with a strained softness, "Emily, he's your brother. He just needs a little help to get back on his feet." I turned to her and replied as calmly as I could, "I've helped him get back on his feet before. More than once, and it didn't go anywhere." My dad cleared his throat and said with a weight he clearly thought should end the conversation, "Family takes care of family. That's how we've always done things." And right then, a slow burn started somewhere in my chest, because I had heard that line my entire life, and it had always meant the same thing. It meant me. It meant my money, my effort, my sacrifice, dressed up in the language of togetherness. I kept my voice level and said, looking directly at my dad, "I work extremely hard for what I have, and I have a son to think about. I can't keep giving money that never comes back." Mark's patience ran out faster than he probably intended. He said with an edge creeping into his voice, "You know what your problem is? Ever since you married that guy, you've changed. You used to actually care about this family." I felt the anger flare up hot and fast, but I pushed it down and replied, with a quiet that I knew would land harder than yelling, "Don't do that. My answer is no. And bringing Daniel into this doesn't change anything." My mom tried one more time. She reached over and placed her hand over mine and said with eyes that were starting to fill, "We're not asking for much. We just need you to think about what's right." I looked at her hand on mine and felt something complicated move through me. Something that was part love and part exhaustion and part grief for the family I had always wished we could be. I pulled my hand back gently and said quietly, but without any room left for negotiation, "I've thought about it, and my answer is still no." I left shortly after. The drive home was quiet. I kept both hands on the wheel and stared at the road ahead, trying to organize what I was feeling into something manageable. But I couldn't shake the look on Mark's face when I said no. It wasn't just disappointment, it was something colder than that. Something that felt a lot like a decision being made. That was the moment everything changed. I just didn't realize how far they would go. New Year's Eve arrived the way it always does in Chicago. Cold, gray, and indifferent. the kind of cold that doesn't just sit in the air but gets into your bones and stays there. By 5 in the afternoon, the temperature had already dropped below 20 degrees, and the wind off the lake was making it feel even worse. I was in my bedroom getting ready for a late shift. One of my clients had a hearing first thing in the morning on January 2nd, and there was a stack of documents that still needed to be organized and reviewed before the night was out. It wasn't how I wanted to spend New Year's Eve, but that was the job. That had always been the job. Ethan was sitting on the edge of his bed when I knocked and pushed open his door. He had his headphones around his neck and was staring at his phone without really looking at it. The kind of stillness that meant he was thinking about something he didn't want to talk about. I leaned against the doorframe and said as gently as I could, "Hey, I've got to go in tonight. I'm going to drop you at Grandma and Grandpa's, okay?" He looked up slowly and said with a flatness that made my chest tighten, "I don't really want to go over there." I crossed my arms and replied as evenly as I could manage, "I know. But I can't leave you here alone all night. It's New Year's Eve." He was quiet for a moment, then said without much fight left in his voice, "Is Uncle Mark going to be there?" I hesitated, just for a second, but long enough that he noticed. I said, keeping my voice steady, "I'm not sure, probably." He looked back down at his phone and didn't say anything else. I stood there for a moment longer, watching him, feeling that familiar pull of guilt that had become a constant companion over the past few months. The tension between him and my family had been building quietly in the background, separate from everything going on with Daniel, but connected to it in ways I hadn't fully worked out yet. I told myself it would be fine. My parents were his grandparents. Whatever was going on between me and Mark, whatever resentment had been building since I said no to the money, they wouldn't take that out on an 11-year-old kid. That's what I told myself. We drove mostly in silence. Ethan had his headphones on and his forehead resting against the cold window. The streets were already starting to fill up with people heading out to celebrate, strings of lights blinking from storefronts, the distant sound of something being set up for a midnight show downtown. I pulled into my parents' driveway and put the car in park. I turned to look at Ethan and said, reaching over to squeeze his shoulder, "It's just one night. I'll be back before midnight if I can, and if not, I'll call you right at 12, okay?" He pulled one headphone off and looked at me with an expression that was trying very hard not to show how much he didn't want to be there. Then he said in a small voice that I've replayed in my head 100 times since, "Okay." I walked him to the door. My mom answered and pulled Ethan into a hug that seemed warm enough. My dad gave him a nod from the hallway. Mark was somewhere inside. I could hear the television. Nobody said anything directly to me about money or Daniel or any of it. It all looked completely normal. I hugged Ethan one more time at the door and said quietly into the top of his head, "I love you. Be good." He hugged me back briefly and then stepped inside. I walked back to my car, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway. The whole way to the office, something sat heavy in my stomach. Not a thought exactly. More like a feeling I couldn't name, and didn't know what to do with. I turned up the radio to drown it out. As I drove away, I had no idea. I was leaving my son in danger. The call from my neighbor came in at 9:10 p.m. I was at my desk, highlighter in hand, halfway through a stack of documents. When I saw her name on the screen, I almost let it go to voicemail. I'm glad I didn't. Her voice was careful, the kind of careful people use when they're trying not to panic you before they've said the thing that will panic you. She said slowly, as if measuring every word, "Emily, I don't want to alarm you, but I looked out my window about 10 minutes ago, and I'm pretty sure I saw Ethan standing on your parents' front porch. He's been out there a while. It's really cold tonight." I pushed back from my desk and said with my voice already tightening, "Are you sure it was him?" She replied quietly, "I'm pretty sure, honey. He's got that blue jacket on, the one he always wears." Something dropped in my stomach. I asked her immediately, "Can you do a video call right now? I need to see." 30 seconds later, her camera was pointed across the street, and there he was, my son, standing on the front porch in the dark, arms pulled tight across his chest, his whole body shaking in that slow, rhythmic way that happens when the cold has already gotten deep. The porch light wasn't even on. Right then, my mind went completely blank for one full second before everything came rushing back at once. I grabbed my keys, told my neighbor to please go get him, and I was already moving toward the door before the call even ended. I called Ethan while I was running to my car. He picked up on the second ring, and the sound of his voice, quiet and hoarse, hit me somewhere I didn't have a word for. I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice, "Ethan, are you outside right now?" He said with a steadiness that was worse than crying would have been, "Yeah." I unlocked my car and got in and said as firmly as I could, "How long have you been out there?" A pause. Then he said simply, "A while." I started the engine and said, "Who put you outside?" Another pause, longer this time. Then he said in a flat voice that told me he'd already processed whatever emotion came with the answer, "Uncle Mark." The words hit me like a physical thing. I gripped the steering wheel and said barely above a whisper, "What happened?" And then he told me. He said it all in that same quiet, matter-of-fact tone, like he was describing something that had happened to someone else. He told me that about 2 hours after I dropped him off, Mark had come into the living room where he was sitting and told him to turn off the TV. He said Mark stood over him and said with a coldness that Ethan described as nothing like his normal voice, "You're not actually family. You know that? Your mom chose that guy over us. Which means you're not really one of us either." Ethan said he didn't say anything back. He just sat there. Then Mark pointed at the front door and said with a finality that left no room for argument, "Go wait outside until I say you can come back in." Ethan said he looked at my parents, who were both in the room. Neither of them said a word. My dad looked at the floor. My mom turned toward the kitchen. And Ethan, 11 years old, got up, walked to the front door, and went outside, because he didn't know what else to do. He stood there for 2 hours. In below freezing weather. In the dark. Alone. By the time my neighbor saw him, his hands had gone numb, and he'd stopped feeling his feet. When she came across the street and wrapped a blanket around him and brought him inside her house, he didn't cry. He just said thank you. That detail broke something in me that I don't think ever fully healed. I was on the highway by then, driving faster than I should have been. One hand on the wheel, and one pressed flat against my sternum, like I could hold myself together from the outside. I kept thinking about my parents sitting in that warm house, knowing he was out there, and choosing to do nothing, not stopping Mark, not opening the door, nothing. The rage that moved through me in that car was unlike anything I had felt before. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was cold and clear and absolute, like a door closing and locking from the inside. That's when I stopped being a daughter and became just a mother. I called Daniel from the highway. I don't even fully remember making the decision to do it. My fingers just found his name and hit call before my brain had caught up. He picked up on the first ring. I said with my voice cracking in a way I couldn't control, "Daniel, something happened to Ethan. He's at Mrs. Patterson's house across from my parents. I'm on my way, but I'm still 20 minutes out. Can you go right now?" He didn't ask a single question. He said without hesitation, "I'm already grabbing my keys." The line went dead. That was it. No negotiation, no asking for details, no hesitation. Just action. I drove the rest of the way with both hands on the wheel and my jaw clenched so tight it ached. When I finally pulled up to Mrs. Patterson's house, Daniel's truck was already parked out front. I ran to the door, and she let me in before I even knocked. Ethan was on her couch, wrapped in a thick blanket, a mug of something warm held between both hands. Daniel was sitting on the coffee table directly across from him, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, talking to him in a low, steady voice. He looked up when I came in, and something in his expression told me the situation before any words did. I crossed the room and dropped to my knees in front of Ethan, and said with my hands on both sides of his face, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I left you there." Ethan looked at me and his chin wobbled once, just once. And then he pulled it back together in that heartbreaking way kids do when they've decided they're not going to cry anymore. He said quietly, "I'm okay, Mom." But he wasn't okay. Daniel had already called 911 before I arrived. Not because Ethan was in immediate danger by then, but because he understood before I did that what had happened needed to be documented. The paramedics arrived about 8 minutes after I got there, checked Ethan's temperature, checked his fingers and toes for signs of frostbite, asked him questions in calm professional voices. His core temperature was low but not dangerously so. His hands had taken the worst of it. The paramedic, a woman with short gray hair and a no-nonsense manner, looked at me and said with a directness I appreciated, "He's going to be fine physically, but I'd recommend getting him checked out at the hospital just to be thorough. And I'd also recommend you talk to someone about how this happened tonight." I nodded and said steadily, "I already planned to." We took Ethan to the hospital as a precaution. Daniel drove. I sat in the back with Ethan, his head leaning against my shoulder, neither of us talking much. At some point during that drive, Ethan lifted his head and looked across the seat at Daniel in the front. He was quiet for a long moment, watching him drive. Then he said in a voice so small I almost missed it, "You came really fast." Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror and replied without making it into something bigger than it was, "Of course I did." Ethan looked back down and didn't say anything else. But something had shifted. I could feel it in the air of that car, quiet and fragile and real. At the hospital, they got Ethan into a room and started warming him up properly. Daniel stayed the entire time. He sat in the corner chair, out of the way, not inserting himself, not trying to be the center of anything, just there. When Ethan got cold apple juice from the nurse and made a face at the taste, Daniel said from the corner with a perfectly straight face, "They never have the good stuff in these places." Ethan looked at him for a second, and then, for the first time in as long as I could remember, my son laughed. It was small and short and exhausted, but it was real. And watching it happen, watching Daniel sit in that hospital corner and pull one small laugh out of my kid on the worst night of his life, I felt something in my chest give way completely, not in a painful way. In the way that happens when something that's been held too tight for too long finally gets to let go. Because I had spent 2 years trying to show Ethan who Daniel really was. Trying to explain it, defend it, prove it in the small daily ways that never seemed to add up to enough. And in one night, without a speech or an argument or a single word of convincing, Daniel had simply shown up. And in that moment, my son saw something I had been trying to show him for years. I didn't sleep that night, not even close. I sat in the hospital chair next to Ethan's bed until he finally drifted off somewhere around 2 in the morning, and then I just stayed there in the dark, listening to him breathe, watching his chest rise and fall, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Daniel had stepped out to get coffee and give us space. The room was quiet, except for the low hum of the hospital equipment and the distant sound of a television somewhere down the hall. And in that stillness, something settled inside me with a finality I hadn't felt before. Not anger exactly, though the anger was still there, running underneath everything like a current. It was more like clarity. The kind that comes after you've been confused for so long that the moment the fog lifts, you almost don't recognize what you're looking at. By the time the sun came up on New Year's Day, I had already made 2 decisions. The first was to call the police. The second was to call Child Protective Services. I made both calls from the hospital parking lot while Daniel sat with Ethan upstairs. The officer I spoke to was professional and thorough. He asked me to walk through the timeline, which I did, step by step, keeping my voice as level and factual as I could manage. When I finished, he said carefully, "Ma'am, based on what you're describing, this does constitute child endangerment. We'll need to take a formal statement and we'll be following up with the individuals involved." I said without any hesitation, "I understand. I'll cooperate fully with everything you need." The CPS call was harder. Not because I doubted it, but because saying the words out loud to a stranger made it undeniably real. When the caseworker asked me to describe what had happened, I heard my own voice go flat and precise the way it does in a courtroom, and I realized I was treating this like a case. Maybe that was the only way I knew how to survive it. Over the next 3 days, I moved in pure documentation mode. I pulled together everything I had. Mrs. Patterson gave a written statement. The paramedics filed their report. The hospital documented Ethan's condition on arrival. I requested the 911 call logs. I took photographs of the front porch where Ethan had been left standing. I wrote down Ethan's account word for word while it was still fresh, dated it, signed it, and had it notarized. I had spent 15 years building cases for other people. Now I was building one for my son. On the third day, my mom called. I let it ring. She called again an hour later, and I picked up. Before she could say anything, I said with a quiet that I knew she would recognize as something different from my usual tone, "I need you to listen to me very carefully right now. I'm not calling to fight. I'm calling to tell you what is going to happen next." She started to say something, and I said firmly but evenly, "Please don't. Just listen." And then I told her. I told her that I had already spoken to the police and to CPS. I told her that I was pursuing this legally and that Mark was going to be held accountable for what he did to my son. I told her that I expected her and Dad to cooperate fully with any investigation. The silence on her end stretched out long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said in a voice I hadn't heard from her before, something between disbelief and fear, "Emily, you cannot be serious. He's your brother. We're your family. You're going to drag us through the courts over one bad night?" Right then, the cold anger in my chest flared up sharp and clean. I said with a steadiness that surprised even me, "He left my 11-year-old son outside in below-freezing weather for 2 hours. As a punishment. For something I did. And you sat in that house and let it happen. So yes, I'm serious," she said with her voice rising. "You pushed us to this. You chose that man over your own family, and Mark was just trying to make a point." I felt my jaw tighten and replied with a control I had to work hard to maintain. Making a point to an 11-year-old child, in 20-degree weather, in the dark. She didn't answer that. I said before ending the call, "I love you, but I will not protect Mark from the consequences of what he did. Not this time." I hung up. 2 days later, Mark called from a number I didn't recognize, clearly thinking I wouldn't pick up if I saw his name. The moment I heard his voice, he said with an aggression. He wasn't even trying to disguise. "You really want to do this? You want to make an enemy out of your own family over some kid who isn't even blood?" And just like that, every last thread of restraint I had been holding on to snapped clean. I said in a voice so cold it didn't even sound like me, "Don't you ever refer to my son that way again. And don't call me. Talk to my attorney." I ended the call, sat down at my desk, and opened a new document on my computer. I typed the case header at the top of the page, the way I had done hundreds of times before for other people. Except this time, the name in the file was my own son's. I filed the lawsuit the following morning. When I walked out of the courthouse and stood on the steps in the January cold, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel relieved. I felt the full weight of what I had just set into motion pressing down on me from every direction. When I filed that lawsuit, I knew there was no going back. A year has passed since that night, and my life has changed in ways I never expected. The lawsuit moved forward the way these things do, slowly and painfully, and with a cost that went far beyond money. Mark faced charges of child endangerment. My parents were called in for questioning. The family that I had spent my whole life trying to hold on to, trying to be good enough for, trying to keep the peace with, came apart at the seams in a series of depositions and formal statements and unanswered phone calls. I won't pretend that felt like justice. It felt like amputation. Necessary, maybe, but not painless. Not even close. What I didn't expect was Ethan. About 4 months after that New Year's Eve, we were all in the kitchen on a Saturday morning. Daniel was making pancakes, the kind with blueberries that he'd learned Ethan liked without ever being told directly, just by paying attention. Ethan came downstairs, still half asleep, dropped into a chair, and said without looking up from the table, in the most casual voice imaginable, directed at Daniel, "Hey Dad, can I have orange juice?" The pan went quiet. Daniel turned around slowly. I set down my mug. Ethan was already reaching for a napkin, completely unbothered. like the word had always been there, and he just finally decided to use it. Daniel cleared his throat and said with a steadiness I knew cost him something, "Yeah, buddy, it's in the fridge." I looked down at the counter and pressed my lips together and did not cry. I almost did, but I didn't. That was the moment I understood that some things don't heal on a schedule. Some things just quietly decide they're ready when they're ready. I still think about my parents. I still reach for the phone sometimes and then put it back down. I don't know if what I did was right by every measure. I only know it was right by the one that mattered most. Do I have regrets? Some. But not about protecting my son. Never about that. So I'll ask you the same question I've asked myself every day since that night. If you were in my place, what would you have done?